Hello everyone and welcome to Plough Lane for tonight's friendly debt management meeting of the Donge Trust. Great to see so many of you here in the room and online. So the running order for tonight, we're going to start with a short presentation from Kevin Rye, which is sort of going over some of the things that we went through at the AGM. And then we'll open the floor to questions from both you in the room and those watching online. If you are watching online, please use the Q&A function. I can see some of you have started using it already. So just to run through who's up here with me, my name is George Jones. I'm the Assistant Secretary. I've got Graham Price, our Chair Michelle Little, and Kevin Rye. So I'll now hand over to Kevin for his presentation.
Okay, right. This presentation is largely, well, it isn't largely, it is entirely what I went through at the AGM, talking through the debt consultation programme that we had, and that we're technically still running, but the sort of formal element of that being the surveying and consultation groups that we did in the summer and late summer and early autumn. If we go to the, we're looking at the introduction and conduct of meetings, pretty straightforward. I'm going to do the presentation, then we're going to have some conversations about it. So if we could go to the next slide, please. It's like being on Sky Sports. The output from the debt survey is essentially what we're talking about here, but the important element of this is this was always about the management of debt rather than about having lots of debt and being terribly worried about it. It's about the management of debt in a normal way in a business, which is how we view it and which is how it is. If you could move to the first slide, please, that would be good. Thank you. Summary of findings from the consultation. Next slide, please. So in April 23, we agreed a formal consultation about the management of debt held by the Trust, resulting from the building of Plough Lane, the Plough Lane bonds. That was a fairly well-established figure now of £10.5 million, with the first tranche payable by March 25 of 3.4 million. Now, the consultation, the reason we did it, and I can tell you from a personal perspective, because it was me who pushed the idea of a larger formal consultation process, because it's partly what I do for a living, was because it was more complex than simply putting out a survey and then making a decision. It was more that you had to properly talk about these things, because the figures alone are substantial. The meaning of it is substantial. This is about a stadium. It's not, we borrowed money very sensibly in order to do something we need in order to build the capacity of the football club. That's a very sensible piece of investment. So we needed a sensible conversation. And the whole context of it taking place was, it's a fan-owned football club. So we're not having the conversation about the ownership. It's not what it's about. It's about the manner in which we manage our debt as a fan-owned club. But the possibility of reducing the level of ownership has to be part of the conversation, and we made that clear. Next slide, please. So we had 2 virtual sessions and 1 in Plough Lane, down at the director's box down there, because we had limited membership data. That's something that's changing, isn't it, really, over time, as we move to the new membership system that's with the as well. I ended up using Merton demographic data as a way of trying to weight it, and then a random draw of members, genuinely a random draw. I think I explained I used a wheel of fortune to choose out of who of the applicants would get a place. So it was as fair as we could possibly make it, given the absence of the type of data that lots of organisations like ours would normally have. They took place in July and then in September. Not really much purpose in trying to do it in August, so we went for July and September, and then we sent a survey out in October and November in order to do a much broader sweep of members, because we were very conscious that if you're going to do consultation, you have to do breadth and depth. This is very common in consultation anyway. If you look at local authority consultation, planning consultation, all sorts of things. The purpose of the conversation side is to get into depth and to understand how people are feeling about it, to give much longer form answers. The purpose of the surveying is to see then help you reflect more widely to see if these views are held more widely, if there are common concerns. It helps you to pick up a lot more broader trends, a bit like polling, but without the necessary strictures to it. Polling is a different thing. That's not what this was. This was a survey of members that wasn't weighted in any particular way. It was just to get a view. Next slide, please. And the actual findings. Next slide. I came up with the terms principled and pragmatic, and I think the board fully agree with that, I think. And I think that's really demonstrated over time, that we have a very firm set of principles about how we think the club, well, not how we think the club, how the club must be owned and to some degree operated. But also we're pragmatic. We're prepared to make the right kind of deal within the principles. We're a very values-driven club, and it's we have a very higher purpose. I was speaking with a League One club Monday, about exactly this, the idea of having a purpose, and I sat and reflected the fact that we have a purpose, we have high values, and that I think is a really important thing that we've got to try to remember, especially we're in the midst of a huge, seemingly, huge problem like with debt. We remain fundamentally a vehicle to own AFC Wimbledon. This is how people have clearly demonstrated their responses to what we've done. And as long as we do, as I said, continue in this vein, compromise to enable progress of a fan-owned football club playing at Plough Lane is fine. We're okay with that. And I put examples there, the creation of AFC Wimbledon PLC, the protected settlement to Kingstonian, all these things are the principled but pragmatic approach to being the owners of a football club. Next slide, please. The key is the right protections again, always. We, in giving in the settlement with Kingstonian, that had to be there had to be protections around it. In all sorts of issues around the stadium, we've ensured protection, owning the freehold. All these sorts of things are equally critical in what we're talking about doing next. That if we got the right protections, we can have the compromise can happen. Members do want strict rules on things like blocks of shares. It doesn't take a genius to work out why that's the case. Basic company law will tell you that. Our history will tell you that as a football club over the last 50 years, 60 years. And there is undoubtedly a desire for what it's actually Graham was the person who came up with the term within the board of financial activism, and the idea of being active financially to make sure that we continue to always aim to own as many shares as we can. And I will add this as someone who's worked in this field for 20 years now, that if you don't remain cognizant of your vulnerability, that's where you lose ownership. And one of the things that Wimbledon fans have never done is to lose that cognizance, and that's very, very important, that they always remain with that in mind, that it's perfectly possible to become much more vulnerable without actually intentionally doing it, and all of a sudden you turn around and you've lost control. I think we've lost, there we go. So that's the thought really behind share buyback, and just ensuring that we sustain that ownership, and actively seeking to raise its shareholding, as it says, in line with the principle of ownership. Next slide, please, if there are any left. Are we on the next one? Yes. So in terms of additional considerations, these at the time were things we were thinking about, that the use of restricted actions clauses are obviously, they are going to be the thing that permit any sale of large-scale changes to our ownership, amount of ownership, and that if we're going to use the exercise of restricted actions clauses, then it seems to make sense to authorise that in one go, not the immediate sale of everything in one go, but just to permit the board to go down that road at one point, rather than going back continually for votes. That would be, in terms of process, if I'd have had this conversation with a club in this position 10 years ago, I would have agreed with that approach simply on the basis that process-wise, it glues you up, it binds the club up for possibly years on end, going back and constantly talking about the same issue. And the politics change as well, so it makes sense to think about it in that way. That does mean trust, of course, of the board and the boards, and that's an important element that we have to always remember, that a lot of this is based in the concept of trust and the reality of trust at our football club. Is there any more slides left? There are, yes. Okay. So a couple of other things were capital expenditure. So we all look at this stadium, and it is, I mean, everyone I speak to out in the game talks about how impressive this facility is. You know, it's the best ground in League Two, one of the best grounds they've been to. Don't think we always remember that, but that was because we come here every week. Why would we constantly stand back and admire it? But it's a great stadium. We're in a great position. But there's a lot of things that we need to do. Over time, those things will need to be done. We need to consider that. So in terms of how we manage the debt and how we raise finance to manage that debt, we also need to think about how we're going to invest in order to continue to grow the football club in line with the principle of ownership, and continuing to retain ownership and develop it and strengthen the ownership of the football club by the fans. And that also counts for things like training facilities, because we know that ultimately I'm not as well versed in the state of our facilities and what our needs are, but I know that we are going to need considerable work on that in the future. And we need to make sure that we continue to consider those sorts of things, because we're not just investing in purchasing a stadium and paying the money off. We have to be thinking about running and growing the business over time, because that's ultimately what allows us to be successful in all the areas we are. Two more. Next one, please. That was a bit slow, that one. So the PLC Finance Committee, which is the committee that works on all this stuff, that's the body that's now working on all of the stuff I've been through here. I attended one of those meetings 3 weeks ago, so it's been interesting to sit and listen to the people who are they're the wonks who sit and pore over those figures and tell us what the runes are. And I've never been able to operate in any environment, let alone football, without having people who know what they're talking about. And that committee is full of people who we're very fortunate to have. And we need to allow them to go away and get that work done so they can come back to us and help us to understand what we do next. Okay. And as this says, I mean, this was the AGM, but it's the same because this is what the meeting's for. These are the things broadly that we have to do next. But none of this has been laid out into an absolute plan. Purpose of this meeting and meetings like it and the discussions we have at board, any discussions we might have with other members on match days, at the kiosk, wherever else. We're thinking about how we're going to approach this issue, when we might have any votes that are necessary, what the financial state is at this time, whether it gives us more time or not. But we need to always be thinking that we will have to probably make decisions at some point. And I'll hand over to Graham and Michelle to take us on to the next stage of the discussion.
Thanks, Kevin. Welcome, everyone. Oh, Kevin, can you pass the mic back? Thanks. So this is meant to be a very informal meeting. There aren't really any rules. We're certainly not having any votes. Very happy for people to ask questions or make statements and express their views on anything they're concerned about. For me, it's quite interesting when Kevin and the board first started talking about this process. I think I wasn't overwhelmed with excitement about this great long consultation process, but actually thinking about it now and reflecting and comparing to 2019, where we all, I think most people probably felt like they had a gun to their heads, and it was sell the shares or we're not going to build a stadium. Reflecting on that, I think that what we've done over the last 6 months or so, and are continuing to do, is have a conversation with you all. And we're on a journey together, and we want to bring people along with us. And I think that's really, really important. We don't want to hold a gun to anyone's heads. I think the other point I'd just like to make also is that in terms of timelines, some people have talked about, we should save this for when we really need it, and in an emergency we shouldn't be having a vote unless we really, really need to. Graham and I have been talking about timelines to get this to a conclusion, and we've identified that there are several steps in that process. The first is looking at the rules, both the Dons Trust rules and the PLC articles, to see what changes we need to make and any extra protections that we want to include. And those would have to be done, we believe, at an SGM, both of the Dons Trust and the PLC. So we've identified a date in April for the Dons Trust SGM, where we would like, if possible, to bring potential rule changes to the members and to PLC shareholders to have a view on. That is a completely separate exercise from any vote on changing the percentage of the voting rights that the Dons Trust has in PLC, which we think would take place in the autumn. And as anyone who's familiar with the restricted actions rules is aware, it's a category A vote, and so it would need 2 sets of votes a month apart. So, if you think about this in an emergency situation, we're talking about from now to October, a 9-month process. That's not an emergency process, and as we know, and some people are frustrated about this from time to time, the wheels move quite slowly within our organisation because we are cautious and we don't rush into things. So we need to plan for this, essentially, is what I'm saying, I guess. So I think Graham and I and Kev have a few areas that we'd like to cover off through the course of the evening, but we can take it in sections, and if anybody wants to go off-piste and change the order, that's absolutely fine. But I think let's start by thinking about the debt itself. So we've got over 10 million of debt. Debt in itself isn't bad. Most people have mortgages on their houses. We're very fortunate that we have this debt, but it's not secured on our house here. It's what we call friendly debt. It comes with a cost, but it is by and large owed to fans and people who are of a friendly disposition towards the club. So we need to manage that. We need to be sensible about it. Since 2020, when the first debt was issued, we were in a low interest rate, low inflation environment. We're in a very different place now. And so the first chunk of money that's due to be repaid in 2025, that money is probably paying interest of about 2 or 3%. You could quite easily get that in an instant access account now, very, very low or minimal risk. And so there is an expectation that the people who are, if they do agree to roll over the money, will want a higher interest rate. And that obviously will come at a cost to the club. So, and a knock-on effect potentially in other areas that the club would like to spend money. So what we would like to see is a gradual reduction of the debt over time. I think at the PLC board level, we've talked about reducing the debt by about £500,000 a year. So in this cycle, we are, and based on the surveys that we've done, about half of the 3.4 million of bonds that are due to be repaid next year, that those bondholders have indicated they'd be happy to roll over. So we're sort of looking around that sort of area to try and reduce the debt. Eric, just wait for a mic. Sorry.
Have you got a slide anywhere that shows the tranches that are due and when they're due? Because all I ever really hear about, understandably, is the one that's coming over the hill.
Yeah.
It would be really helpful to have it in front of us, and also, as you helpfully gave, the average interest rate on the next tranche, on each tranche. If we haven't got that, I think we should publish it somewhere accessible, please.
Yeah, it has gone on pro boards from time to time, but I'll give you the sort of broad headlines. The 3.4 in 2025, and then another 3.3 in 2027. And then I think, just trying to think, 10 years on, so probably 2030 will be the next big chunk, which is just over £1 million. So we're talking about debt that goes from 2020 to 2042. We've got a long period of repayment, but those are the three big hurdles. So I think that you know, looking at where we are and the cup runs and everything else, I think we feel like we're getting to a place where we could manage the 2025 redemptions. I think the 27 one is more challenging because it's only 2 years later. And so that's one to be aware of. The original bonds, the 2020, the average interest rate was 2.4%, and then the 2022 bonds, the average was 6%. So across the blended average is 4%, which is where we get to the 400,000 a year. But obviously, so the money that's due to be repaid in 27, that has a much higher coupon than the next year's batch. It'd be interesting where we get to with those, because obviously you would hope by 27, please God, that inflation's dropped and interest rates are down. But we've obviously got to work within the environment that we're operating in. Did you want to say something, Greg?
Yeah. Just coming back to the rollover point, we know that the first tranche is friendlier debt than the second tranche. You can tell that by the interest rate, but of course that call to arms, it was our immediate fan base and our closest friends that participated. The second tranche, the interest rate's higher. There are people who obviously wanted to help us, but were more commercial in their outlook, and we would expect more of them to want to redeem in 27 than is the case off the back of the survey. We don't know that for certain. It might depend on the terms, but all things being equal, as it is at the moment, that's our expectation.
We've got some questions coming through online, so if you are watching online, please use the Q&A functions. I'll sort of ask them throughout the evening. One relevant to what's just been said is from Mark Hendricks, who says, "Isn't banking on cup runs a gamble of the highest order?"
No, we're certainly not banking on cup runs, and we don't budget for them. So they are one. The reason I mention them is they're windfalls. So I think that you know, anyone that's got a reasonable grasp of finances will recognise that using regular income to fund debt repayment is not a good way to go. So what we're trying to do is attribute regular revenue to regular costs, and windfalls like player sales, cup runs, etc., to debt repayment. That doesn't mean, for everyone in the room, and I know for Craig Cope as well, that doesn't mean that all the windfalls go towards debt repayment, but we're trying to build up a pocket of funds from those unexpected gains to help us towards debt repayment over the years.
The next question from the online that we're going to go to is from Alex Sloan, who says, "Have we assessed our ability to pay the debt if we were to be relegated?"
We haven't done a budget yet for next year, so that will be coming to the board in the next month or so, and I don't know whether we will do a relegation budget this year. I hope not. We certainly did last year, but
We have done so far. So we have done 2 scenarios modelling at outset, but that's not updated, because once you know the division you're in, that's the division you're in.
Anyone?
Thank you. Next question from online is John Martin, and then we'll go to some questions in the room. John Martin says, the recent survey indicated that some bondholders would roll over the bond. However, some would want their repayment. How much have we initially already ring-fenced for next year's payments?
So we're building towards 1.7 to repay. What we've talked about at the PLC level and the Finance Committee is whether we set a target and we publish that target, and a bit like we did with the bond, we had a tracker where everyone could see where we were aiming and we celebrated as we got past each milestone, that we do something similar, and that if we find in the process of that redemption renewal process that more people are wanting their money back, then we might open a small pocket of money up to new bondholders. And we've talked about the rate being between 0 and 6%. So we certainly don't want to be accused of the dreaded Ponzi scheme, and that's certainly not what we are doing, which is why we're setting aside money to repay debt. But if we feel it would be beneficial to help the club plan, then we would open it up to a small amount of new money. And I hope that anyone who is a bondholder is fully confident that they are being paid the interest that's due whenever it's due, because that's my job. So and I know that it's done. So I hope there is confidence in the product. One of the things that we're also looking at, which we may or may not be able to offer for 2025, is the possibility of making the bonds an ISA product, so that it's a tax-free interest wrapper, which at the moment it isn't. So obviously anyone that gets paid interest on those bonds has to declare it for tax purposes. But actually Tim Hillier, who's in the room, has kindly started the work on looking at there are other football clubs that offer bonds that are ISA products, and that might make it a bit more attractive. So that's one of the things that we're considering. Sorry, question in the room?
Yeah, hi, good evening everyone.
Could you say your name?
Sure, Michelle, Roger Hopkinson.
Thank you.
Two frustrations, totally agree with Eric. I was expecting to see a classic cash flow type diagram on the screen so everyone could understand the core principles of what you're discussing. And second, the lack of promotion on the Dons Trust board website was really poor. Looked high and low for it. Anyhow, that's where it is. Maybe you could rewind a little bit and start the sort of first principles. What we're paying, what's the £400,000 per annum? There's hopefully lots of people online listening and watching. Maybe rewind a little bit, the £400,000 per annum, going forward, what we're doing. Next year, the repayment, I'm one of the people who said, yeah, I'm happy to roll over, but I want my pitiful £1,000 to start unlocking the real estate in this stadium. Unsurprised, I'm going to say that. Can we reinvest that to create a real estate product which is going to start earning us some money? So 3 points there, yeah?
Yeah. Okay.
What's funny, Graham?
That might be more questions than the 3 points. I was trying to work out how many questions. So going all the way back to the start, the 400,000 is clearly the total interest, back to the average that we've quoted, spread across both tranches of bonds. In terms of the idea, of course, is debt management. We would like to, ideally, on the basis of the survey, because we've surveyed Plough Lane bond holders, because of course they're the first ones to redeem in 2025. That's where we've got the figure from. The figure from that allowed us to budget, which gives us the target for the budgeted repayment. And also going back to some of the other comments, there's been a paper for the board identifying and agreeing what constitutes exceptions, because that wasn't written down before, and then also how those individual exceptions get treated, because it's not automatic that it's 100% of all of them. And on top of that, you want to give some leeway, because if Craig heard that every time a player was sold, all it was going to do is pay off debt, that's somewhat self-defeating in itself. So that's the two bits. So in coming back into the projecting a cash flow, it would be, if you're expecting to see that, all we could do would be what-if scenarios. Because if we roll over, for those that have said they'll roll over, what we don't know is what interest rate they'd select. So that would have that has quite a wide variance on budgeting. But if you assume that everybody who says they'll roll over is happy to do so, then you could project forward. It's a case of how many what-if scenarios we'd want to produce. Coming back to your final point, that is the purpose, and that's the overall purpose of the wider consultation as well, because in order to grow the club, we need to manage our debt. In an ideal world, and this is a personal preference, if we were going to make another major purchase, I would rather make sure that we had a training ground, a training facility. One of the reasons is because if we needed to put a charge against it, we could, rather than put a charge against the ground, but maybe that's just me. But you're right, the whole purpose is to provide space to grow the club and to grow the asset and grow the facility. But to give a precise number on that, we would only be able to do the next projection at the point at which it rolled over and the numbers are known. Yeah.
Well, so I think if you assumed worst case that everyone wanted 6%, then that's going to take us up to 600,000 a year if we don't repay any debt. So we want to try and manage that and keep chipping away at it each year to reduce the load.
And perhaps just remind everyone what our order of magnitude sort of costs are and income per annum as well, as a business.
Well, so our turnover the last year was just under 8 million, and on that we made an operating loss of 1.8 million. So it was a pretty tough year. I think some people have asked about that. 800 grand of that, I think, is depreciation, which is spreading the cost of the stadium over 50 years. So it's an accounting entry, it's not a cash loss. And then, compared to pre-relegation, we lost about 500,000 core funding from the EFL, and obviously we would expect smaller gates in League Two. So compared to prior year, those are some of the reasons why it's worse. Obviously, we then had a terrific year in terms of player sales, but we can't budget for that. So I would hope that with the changes that are being made within the club now coming through on the business side as opposed to the football side, that there should be improvements in the next year on those fronts. But I think for me, when we went out in 2020 and said put money into the bond, give us 5 years, which was the minimum term, and we will get this stadium really working. Obviously then COVID hit, and I would say we probably lost 2 or 3 years in that planning process in terms of really making this stadium work. We're starting to see much more events being held here, etc., but and with James Woodruff coming in as the new MD, I think he's got some really interesting ideas about how to grow revenues too. But it's we're not where we want to be, but we keep working towards it.
Another question similarly online before we go back to questions in the room. Sort of talking about CapEx, at what point do we prioritise potential revenue earning CapEx, such as expanding the stadium or similar, before we start doing bond repayments? Is there a point that we prioritise CapEx?
Well, I think that's a tricky one. Obviously, we would like to do both. To some degree, we're in the hands of the bondholders here because, whatever the club, obviously, if we can put money into CapEx and generate much more revenues from that and a higher percentage, that's great. But if we have a group of people saying they want their money back, we've got to be able to finance that. So I think it's a mixture of all pieces here, isn't it? We want the playing budget as high as possible. We want to repay debt, and we want to invest in our stadium and the other opportunities around. And, you know, I think both Graham and I have agreed, and we've talked about this with the PLC and the Finance Committee, that the piece around the equity and being able to sell that is one of the levers that we would like to have available in our armoury to manage all those different elements.
Just to clarify, just to finalise on that, we're certainly not in favour of using equity to boost the playing budget. We'd seek to grow that more organically. Equity would be used purely for capex or debt repayment if required.
Peter Miller, am I right? I assume I'm right that the two big issues here are possibly reverting, going to 50+1 and reducing debt. They're the two big issues. Can you explain why you believe switching to reducing to 50+1 will help reduce debt when, as we're structured at the moment, there are still shares available for people to buy? And what has generated the 50+1 idea? Has it come from the PLC board, the directors, or has it come from the Dons Trust? Because not going into detail now, at some point there will be a discussion about the possible long-term dangers of going to 50+1. So I can't comprehend why we need to consider going to 50+1 to be reducing debt. Yet these are the two issues that you've acknowledged are being discussed tonight. Or am I wrong?
Slightly wrong, as Kevin alluded to, because it's not just about the debt, although that was the trigger for the discussion. It's also to do with how we grow the club, because at the moment, the remaining equity, it came up from the Finance Committee in discussion, and it also came up from people approaching us and saying, there's equity left, can I convert my bond at the end into equity?
As I understand it,
Mike.
it was Michelle.
Hold on, Peter. Could Graham just answer your questions before you ask another one?
He said it was slightly wrong. Could we be precise about my point about why is 50+1 being so closely linked to reducing debt?
As we stand at the moment, on the survey that we've done, with the equity that's available, assuming that nobody else comes in to take that equity, because there have been discussions about that in relation to other projects, we would, I'll say muddle is not the right word, we will get through 2025. The next hurdle is 2027. The same issues are going to occur. There is not enough equity for any substantial investment in any capital project. So back to Roger's point about things that can actually help us grow, we have not got the headroom to do that. So as it stands at the moment, something has to give. In other words, something has to be delayed. We will get to where we want to get to, regardless of if we have a vote or not, but we might have to take longer to do it. And if that's what we decide to do as fans and as owners of the club, that is completely acceptable. But it would be silly for us not to think about the future and how we're going to grow things now. This is not a binary debate.
But,
Wait a minute.
I'm sorry.
Wait a minute.
Hang on, Peter. Can you hold on a minute, please, because you've been asked to. There is an additional issue here, which I wanted to just add to, which is, and it's a term that I bore people with repeatedly in football, which is the politics of it. And why it's relevant is because I know, having done work in these environments for 20 years, especially around fan ownership, I understand how nervous people get when you start talking about reducing the shares. Now, one of the problems with ownership by fans is always that it's seen as a stopgap, effectively. It's seen as, well done, pat on the head, you go off, we'll bring in the real people. Now, we're full of the real people. We know how to run this business. We've got one person here who did it, and we've got plenty of people here who know what they're talking about. We've done this collectively. There's no argument about us being capable of doing it. The key, really, in all these environments is always whether or not members remain cognizant of that, of the fact that there is a degree of vulnerability. That's why we have the protected restricted actions. That's why when you make a decision like that, you're not going into it, as with all other conversions from fan ownership to private ownership, has been a straight 50% plus one vote of the membership. That's how it's happened, Peter. Well, you can shake your head, but it's true. And in fact, that's how Newport converted to private. From private to fan. I'm answering because it's nuanced, Peter. The thing I don't understand that you want is, do you want me to say that there's some ulterior motive behind it, or do you want us to say that we're not thinking about it? Or, the truth is, this is a really difficult set of circumstances for any business, as we all know. It's a difficult decision to make, and the reason we've gone down the path of having an elongated, lengthy process of consultation is precisely because of our history and because we understand the issues around this. The second bit I'd say is I've come from a very sceptical point of view around this 50% plus one, because I've never believed it to be some kind of panacea. I've been someone who's wanted to be persuaded of the merits of it for the purpose it's required. And I'm becoming more convinced of the requirement for it and the necessity of it only in order to retain our position as owners. That's the only way I will ever consider voting for it. And at this stage, we're not even there. So I would just give us a little bit more credit that this is being thought through, and to some extent we're sort of feeling our way a bit, because that's the nature of consultation in this kind of environment.
To pass on to George first.
Yeah, can you give him? Yeah, we've had a couple of questions online before we come back to those in the room. Adam Russell says, our last accounts stated that we had a loss of 1.8 million. He would like to find out, where do we find the 1.7 million for the bond repayments?
For next year?
For next year.
Yes, so sorry if I didn't make that clear enough. So as part of the monthly financial report that we get at the PLC level, Laurie, who's our head of finance, has created a section called Debt Tracker, and he's basically compiling a list of income in the windfall category that we've been generating to go towards the debt repayment. Part of that is player sales, some of which we have already delivered on, and some of which we've still got to potentially fund. But I think we're feeling more comfortable that we can fund the 2025 repayments. Obviously, if all 3.4 million said they wanted their money back, that's a lot bigger number to achieve based on us currently working towards 1.7. So, I don't think in an ideal world, I think we would prefer to sell equity to boost the development of the stadium or the training ground. But, we also need to be aware of the debt. So I think we need to manage it. We need to see how much needs to be repaid, and we need to find a way to do that. And we don't really want to do it in such a way that has a dent in our playing budget, for example. I don't think people would appreciate that.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions coming through online. Jane Lonsdale would like you to repeat what you were saying about constitution/article changes coming in the spring.
Okay, so based on the discussions we've had so far, we've identified a couple of areas in particular that we want to look at, and we've got legal advice on article changes. One of which I think we believe that there is support for is that we shouldn't be selling. So if you imagine at the moment we've got 80% of the shares owned by the Dons Trust, so we've got 5% that we could sell right now if someone came along. If we got the vote through and we were allowed to drop down to 51%, then effectively we'd have about 30% of equity available. We wouldn't want to sell that to one person. I don't think anyone is comfortable with one person having over 25%, and I think we are thinking along the lines of limiting it to probably 15% for one party. So that's one of the changes that we would be looking at embedding in our rules at both levels, that no one investor can own more than 15% of the club. The other main thing is for the Dons Trust to have to grant their permission for any shares to be sold, so that you can't effectively have a group of shareholders working themselves together to sell and build up that shareholding. So those are the two main areas that we're looking at and that we've got legal advice on. I think one in its simplest form is basically saying whatever the actual shareholding that the Dons Trust has in the club, they will always have 51% of the voting rights. So those are the areas at the moment. Obviously, if there are any other areas that the people in the room or online who are good at looking at legal documents have a view on in terms of other protections that we need to add, then very, very happy to hear that. And as I said earlier, that we would be aiming to bring resolutions in April on any rule changes ahead of any vote later on in the year.
Hazel Williams, watching online, says, are we able to invest any windfalls on the short-term market?
So, do you want to cover that, the Treasury?
Yes, so one of the things that we put in place, when you talk about short-term, I take it you're talking about slightly longer duration or cash or near cash instruments. So, but on that basis, one of the things that we put in place is a treasury management system, so that different durations can be taken, so that our interest rate on any cash held is higher than simply holding it, say, on co-op 30-day notice or on instant access. So there's a more nuanced approach. Also, there's less risk because of the way in which the financial compensation scheme works and the coverage. So the idea there is, through a blended approach, that we would have a higher rate of interest on our cash holdings. So yes.
Stephen Hunt says, is there an argument to go to, let's say, 61% or similar, to give us more headroom now and then still give us a bit of leeway to drop down in the future if we need to?
So, a couple of issues with that. In terms of company law, I don't believe there's any great difference between going below 75 and then 51. There's no trigger level in between those two. So there's no benefit to us in saying, okay, let's do a vote that says now we can go to 60. I think in a way that just ties the board's hands, because it limits how much equity is available for sale. And as I described earlier, this whole process ending up in a vote is quite a lengthy one. So the idea of keep coming back to members again and again and again is not something we really want to achieve.
So Jeff Steele would like to know, are we still wedded to the two classes of share now? So now that some are owned outside of the DT?
I think if we're being honest, the answer would be no. We can look at potentially looking at how we can use the share structure in different ways. We haven't done so, but that's not to say that we wouldn't consider looking at creating another share class if it was for the benefit of overall fan ownership.
And just to say, by way of introduction, we have our new Don's Trust Secretary in the room, sitting at the back, Andrea Knox, who is a specialist in company law and also insolvency. Not that we are needing to consider insolvency, but she's quite good at looking at schemes and ways of operating to deliver the best result. And that's fantastic to have her on board, because we currently use Brown Jacobson as our law firm to advise on company law, and also they did a lot of work on the bonds when they were being set up, and they're also advising us now on the next stage for 2025. But it's great to have Andrea on board, because hopefully she will be able to also work her way through in minute detail on any of the changes that we are contemplating. So one of the things we've already started talking about very loosely are there other ways of looking at the classes of shares that achieve the result without having to go below 75%. We're nowhere near there yet, but you know, we will keep talking and we'll keep exploring the options.
There is a bit of confusion from those watching online about what's being sort of put forward in April. Dan Revel says, can you confirm, are you wanting to change the rules so we don't need to have a restricted action to sell down to 50% plus one?
No. So what we're looking at is a two-stage approach. Firstly, in April, to look at what rule changes we need to add extra protections. So, for example, putting a limit of 15% on any individual shareholder, making sure that the Don's Trust has to say yes or no to any future share sale. So that would be resolutions at the Don's Trust SGM, and we would almost certainly have to have a PLC SGM to change the rules. The vote on whether we go below 75%, which is a restricted action in itself, that vote would come later on in the autumn if we decided to do it. And that will be a two-stage vote. So we would have to have half of the members voting, and of those 75% in favour of the vote, and then that would have to be repeated 1 month later. So we wouldn't be planning to do any of that in April. It would be purely looking at rule changes and protections, so that hopefully we've got those protections in place after April, and that members are satisfied that those are adequate protections, so that when we come to a vote in the autumn, we're not in the place we are now, which is we don't have those extra protections. So we don't think it would be right and proper to go to a vote now. We need to do it in those stages.
Michelle, if I can ask a question, Andy Ramsden speaking. What I was going to ask you is that you said earlier on that we still had a few percent at the current status of 75 plus 1. If we do constitutionally take it down to 50 plus 1, what makes us believe we can sell those shares?
Yeah, so I had a good discussion with Edward Leake about this, because he, amongst, not the only person, but amongst a number of people on the Finance Committee, has been involved in discussions with various shareholders, interested shareholders, over the last 2 or 3 years. And I'd say a couple of things. So we keep having a discussion on this 5%, and it never gets anywhere. And I think there's two reasons. So the first of all is that most people who come along want to be involved in some way. They want to feel like they're making a difference. They want to have some sort of influence. And we have only, and I think understandably with a large sum of money, what that means is a seat on the board of the PLC. We have only given someone a seat on the PLC because of their equity for Nick Robertson. And that actually didn't happen at the time he put his money in. He didn't want a board seat, but later on in the period we said, well, actually it would really strengthen our board to have you on there, and we went through a process and that went through to members. So I think we believe that we need to be offering equity of more than 10% to someone with a potential opportunity of a board seat for it to be interesting. So that's the first bit. And then the second bit is, when we are trying to sell the equity, it's not very exciting to say, oh, your money's just going to go to pay down debt. It's much more interesting to say, give us a few million to help support the investment in a training facility, for example. So at the moment, the maximum we could sell is worth about 1.7 million, which, whilst helpful to pay down a chunk of debt, absolutely that would be good. It's not enough to really move the dial in terms of capex and development opportunities.
To give a bit of context to that, if we sold all of the remaining equity, 1.65, 1.7, that would only just be enough to help fit out the third floor once we'd decided exactly what to do with it. And that's not regarded as a major project. So as Roger knows from the work that he's contributed to previously, that the numbers involved in everything else are substantially above that.
Okay. Roger Hopkinson, if I didn't say it earlier, thank you very much for doing this anyhow. I'm more simplistic in the finance. You sort of just started to answer this question. How do you value the pounds element of the equity percentage? You know, if Nick's was 2.5 million for, I forget his percentage, going forward, how are you what part of the business is it based on?
Well, so effectively the valuation is the same valuation as it's been all along, which is 83p a share. And we hold to that valuation. Obviously, if we did reduce the debt significantly, you would expect the valuation to go up. But you know, at the end of the day, it's a commercial deal. So you know, we have had people come and say that's too high. It's not justified. I mean, obviously, we've got a great chunk of real estate in a great part of London, so you would hope that is justified. But that's the basis on which we put the offer together at the moment.
At some point there would be a revaluation, Roger, you're quite correct. If we were able to repay a substantial amount of debt, my best guess at the moment would be that it would be after the 27 repayment, or at the point at which we know that we're going to pay off X at 2027. That would be a point for a revaluation, but at the moment, negligible. So as an exercise, not worth carrying out currently.
Jane Lonsdale, watching online, wants to know what protections and benefits are there at 75% that we'd lose if we drop below?
So just from a company law point of view, I suppose the main thing is that in order to pass a special resolution, you need to have 75% of the voting rights. So if you go below that, then you would be, or we would be, reliant on other shareholders to help us pass that. So, you know, in an ideal world, we don't want to go below 75%. We're trying to balance all the different elements of it, and we don't live in a perfect world, so.
And also that is a reason to revisit the restricted actions now, rather than waiting and then saying, oh, here's one we should have considered previously. So we don't hold ourselves as hostage to fortune, although the likelihood of not being able to get something through early on before an investor came in is pretty small.
Thank you. The one question that's come up online with a couple of people raising it, how much of the ALI money will be reinvested into the squad and how much will go into debt?
I'm not going to give any precise numbers, but more money is going into the debt than the playing budget.
Can I ask you a question again, Andy Ramsden? If we're looking at it as a business, you mentioned earlier on that how much money we'd lost and it was on the debt by dropping from League One to League Two. Surely a good business investment is to get us back up to League One, where we would get back that payment, we would earn a new amount of income?
Well, it's a risky business, but that's football, isn't it? I mean, that's exactly what some clubs do, you know, use one-off sums of money to go into the playing budget in the hope that they'll get promoted. It's not guaranteed. We'd rather use one-off sums for capex or for debt repayment and grow our revenues organically through the stadium to fund the playing budget.
Eric?
There's lots of points I'd like to make, but I'll try not to make this a conversation. It seems to me that I believe you're quite right in saying that we shouldn't sell equity in order to fund operations, the team, or even running this building. So it seems to me there's two sorts of money we'd raise from selling equity. One is to help pay down the debt, the other is to create some capital investment. I find those are on a different scale of my nervousness about them. But if we just pass a resolution that passes a restricted action, both are open to the board with very limited further say, I think, by the membership, and that makes me nervous. I'll just leave that with you. But I do think they're different in nature. We might, in an emergency, need to sell some equity to pay off some debt, otherwise we're in deep trouble, whereas there would be a longer, I'd hope, considered time spent on thinking about capital investment to grow the business. If I understand the numbers right, I think you said there's 5% we could sell, which would give us 1.5 million?
1.7.
Okay.
So
in fact, if we sold down to 50%, according to my arithmetic, we'd raise exactly the amount to pay off the debt. I'm not saying we should, but we could. There's a balance there, isn't there? Because if you go down the route of capex, you don't have the option necessarily to get the equity. And both of those things, I'd like to be satisfied there's a really deep thought being given to that. So I'll just leave that there. It's just a comment, not a question. I do have a question, though, which is, if we retained something like the current voting structure, where A shares have 3 votes and B shares have 1, and we were to sell down to 50 plus 1% vote, because at the moment you've got 80% shares and 96% vote, whatever. Perhaps this is for Andrea to answer at a different time. Is there sort of an argument and a legal case to be made by people who own the majority of the shares but not the majority of the votes to say that's an oppression of the majority? Is there a legal argument that puts us at risk? I'd like to think we'd considered that and looked into it.
So
the last point I'd like to make is a question to you. You talked about not being able to do special resolutions. You didn't actually say what that meant. What is it we couldn't do if we went below 75% we can do now? Because I think for most non-accountants or non-lawyers, frankly, that doesn't mean anything to say we couldn't pass a special resolution.
Do you want to?
So can I just pick up on some of those, Eric? Coming back to, and I agree with you about the magnitude. There is no silver bullet here. So the idea that we would immediately find somebody and go to 50 plus 1 or 51 doesn't make any sense anyway. In fact, it's poor business, to be honest. The other side to the coin is around us as owners and what we do and how we can, was it what was the phrase, the price of democracy is constant vigilance. Well, I think it's the case here for fan ownership, but on top of that, there's also a degree of constant activism. And if you look at what's happened elsewhere, where fan ownership has disappeared, it's because they've fought a battle, think they've won, and then it just drifts away, and we can't let that happen. So there are a number of things that we consider, and that's why I've said about financial activism from the Dons Trust membership point of view. So if we go all the way back, when we raised funds originally to purchase Kings Meadow, that's where the shares in the PLC come from originally, there's approximately other minority shareholders. It's about 4.4, I think, last time I looked at the share register. Now, those people basically put the money in as a donation. They might hold 1,000 shares, but it's a donation. So one of the things we can look at is asking people to donate their shares back again. So you've made one donation, and it could be linked into a specific project, which comes back to your issues, Roger. There's more than one way to skin a cat. So there are various things that we need to do as a membership to be financially active, to be, as Kevin rightly said, to be cognizant of what we need to do. So it's not just one side of the coin, there's two sides. You also talked about minority considerations. Obviously there's other companies out there. Young's for a long time had A and B shares. Manchester United have A and B shares. Depends on how you weight them, of course. We've tried to show and give consideration to minority shareholders. The shareholders have made a decision on which share class they buy. In most instances, it's the one vote share class that's been made available. But as owners, we have agreed that the minority representatives, for example, on the PLC, that the Dons Trust wouldn't exercise their vote because we were concerned about whether that would be seen as dominating the minority interests. But we would have to remain fully aware of that through any process or any alteration.
Hold on a second.
Okay. Around minority.
It's actually a boring, nerdy technical point, which is that you could end up with the majority of shares as a percentage owned by a group of people who don't own the majority of votes. And I would like someone to check the legal position of whether we would be subject to challenge for not owning the majority of shares and yet controlling the company. That's what I was getting at.
Okay.
And just to clarify on your numbers, Eric, so currently we have 80% of the voting rights. We're already at 70% of the number of shares. So it's that way around. We're already below 75% in terms of number of shares.
But it is worthwhile checking, because it hasn't come up. So I like your nerdy point.
We've had a fair few questions come in online, so we'll get through.
Hold on.
Eric, can you just wait for the mic and then go again?
Yeah.
Special resolution point.
Yeah.
You didn't answer it.
Do you want to answer it?
In terms of, so from special resolution, this comes back to my comment earlier on the restricted actions. So how we would use that, so we'd have to work in concert with others. There are other areas where we could have special resolution.
I think Eric's question's about what is a restricted action, what would we...
No, that's a special resolution.
You said if we went below 75%, we couldn't pass a special resolution in the PLC. So what is it we can't do if we go below 75%? It's nothing to do with the Dons Trust, it's to do with the PLC.
So, for example, rule changes. So
Yeah.
it's a different threshold of at what percentage you need to pass a change in the rules. So there's ordinary resolutions and there are special resolutions. So certain things require a special resolution. But I mean, I don't think they're significant in my mind, but others may think they are.
Okay, so we've had a couple of questions come through online. Jeff Ricketts, how many 89p shares are still available, if we know that?
Well, it's, as I say, it's about 5% of the voting rights. So if someone can do the maths, 83p, and the total is 1.7 million in terms of value.
Matt Derry would like to know, based on the survey done to bondholders and the people who said they'd roll over, do we expect that number to change if the Dons Trust reduce their shareholding below 75%?
I don't think they're related in my mind. So just in terms of the process as well that's going to happen, we're in the middle of rebuilding the Plough Lane Bond website to enable people to make choices. So that might be rollover, repay, donate, if we're really lucky, to the trust or the club, or convert into equity. And our aim is to have that live in sort of March, April time for the people who are due to have their money paid back by June 2025. In terms of planning for the club, we would like people to make a decision by September so that we have time between September and the spring to manage that. Hopefully, given where we are in terms of the debt tracker, we're in a good place already, but we certainly wouldn't want to leave it to a month before redemption to get a view from someone.
Lauren would like to know what safeguards could we put in place to prevent a group of minority shareholders getting together to get more than 25% and then potentially blocking a restricted action in the future.
So it's not a restricted action. They wouldn't be able to block the restricted actions are at the Dons Trust level, not the PLC level. So a 25% shareholder in the PLC wouldn't be able to block it. They're completely separate. So they could potentially, stop a special resolution passing.
Another question from online is talking about what could we have any enforceable buyback protections or first rights to buy in any future share sales?
Well, so I think the wording in terms of the legal advice is twofold. One is that the Dons Trust has to approve any sale and also has the first right of refusal to buy.
On top of that, this comes back to my comment about financial activism. We actually need to have the funds available to do that.
Mark Hendricks coming on, it was something we discussed earlier. What safeguards are there in place that the DTB will not implement rule changes such as 50+1 if turnout is not met on a restricted action vote?
Well, if the turnout isn't there, the vote doesn't pass. So there's no way the board could do anything in that regard. That's the whole point of the restricted actions. So for anyone that has been involved in the voting on that previously, it's quite an extensive exercise and does need a large number of people. I mean, if you think about tonight, if we've got in total about 100 people involved, our membership is about 3,600, 3,700 of voting members. So, you're talking about half of those being engaged to vote and 75% of those being in favour. So it's quite an undertaking and certainly not something that the 8 or 9 people on the board can influence.
The last one that's been posted at the moment online is from John Martin. Basically says how much of the 1.5 million repayment for next year do we have ring-fenced today, and how much do we still have to put aside?
Well, we are not at midnight yet, so and we are on the last day of the transfer window, so I can't comment on how any funds might still be being used. But obviously that's a variable in how much of the recent sale we will be putting towards debt. But we're in a good place. We've had some good cut work, and we've got over the line a really, really good sale with potential not just for short-term gain, but potentially for long-term gain in terms of the sell-on. And for me, the really good news about the Ali deal is that the lump sum will all be paid by January next year. So it's quite often the case that the money is paid over the terms of the contract, but we've negotiated a deal where we will have all the funds in by January next year. So I think that's, we've been very fortunate with Asal that his buyout clause was triggered, so we got all the money up front, and it's not quite up front, but we're near as damn it. So that puts us in a really good place, I think, to manage the debt repayments next year.
Right, Andy Ramsden again. Just lightening the mood a little bit and taking it. There's a question I've been bothered by is what is happening to the PLC's decision on what they're going to do with the third floor, because it's been talked about quite a bit in the past. It seems to have gone quiet. There's that empty room up there, which you alluded to, does need money. Do we know what money we need and what the payout is and how we're going to use it? Education was mentioned, but we don't know.
It depends, yeah, it's what we get for a return on our expenditure. As I alluded to, we were in discussions with somebody about taking the remaining equity, and that related solely to the third floor. It's really something that will be front and central for the new MD. So we'd be looking at what proposals he would like to make about the use of that floor. But it needs to be flexible as well, because ideally we want to use it on match day, not just for a business.
We've had a couple of other questions come in online. Jane Lonsdale would like to know, could we put together a list of things that are covered by special resolutions and publish them, just in case anyone wants to see that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I've got in my notes here examples of what one is. I think that is absolutely needed.
And Ian Pollock would like to know, why are we waiting till September to find out if individuals will roll over their bonds? Could we not ask sooner?
So, as I said, it's quite a piece of web development work to get this set up. That work's ongoing at the moment, and we are hoping to have the website live by, let's say, April, which means that people will be able to commit and give us a view as soon as it's live. So the aim is that people will keep getting reminders pushing towards September, so that we have a clear view. I hope that we will know earlier than September what the outcome is. I'm just conscious of time, and I think we should take a 10-minute break so people can refresh their glasses, and then we'll take some more questions. Welcome back, everyone. I've got a list of things that we wanted to make sure we covered off, and I think the one thing that we haven't talked about is the sort of wider picture around debt management. As we've talked about, we're very lucky that the debt we have averages 4% interest, which is a really great deal for us as a club. For those of you who remember, before we did the Plough Lane Bond 2, we had a bridging loan with MSP, who basically provided about 5 million of the overall financing towards the completion of the stadium, and we managed to repay that so that we don't have any what's called secured debt. Think about a mortgage on your house. If you can't repay, the building society or bank can call that debt in and seize your house. We were in the position there with that loan from MSP that they had security over this ground. So, it was with great delight that we repaid them and no longer had security. So what we have now, this £10 million of debt, we call it friendly debt, because within the terms of the bonds, nobody could cause the club to go into liquidation. There's no security provided. Just by way of comparison, some people have said, well, rather than selling equity, why don't we go out and get a bank loan, or get something like a mortgage, 10, 15, 20-year loan with an outside provider? There's a couple of issues with that. One, certainly the environment that we're in at the moment in terms of interest rates, we would most likely be looking at least 10%, possibly 15% or more in terms of interest cost. And most of these organisations also then charge another 1 or 2% admin fees on top. So if you think about that, you could be looking at an extra £1 million a year going on interest, which I think we can all see would potentially have an impact on our playing budget. Some people have said, well, why would that interest cost be so high? Why couldn't we get a better deal with a bank? One of the issues we have as an organisation, and I think I talked about the finances earlier, that last year we made an operating loss of 1.8 million before player sales. Any bank, when they're looking at our financial figures and plans, does not take account of player sales. They treat them as windfalls. They're not guaranteed, as we know, and therefore they won't take account of them in any sort of forward planning as to whether we can repay any debt. So when people talk about let's look at every other option before equity, we have looked at that option, and it's not something that we think is right for the club because of the potential cost, and also would almost certainly be secured debt again. So I just wanted to cover that off. Any questions?
Yeah, we've had a couple online that we've still got to go through. Graham Stacey on the topic of selling seats on the PLC. He says, has this been voted on by the DTB, and will it be put to a vote of the wider membership, considering the PLC effectively run the club at the moment?
So when I was referring to a board seat, I was not suggesting that we would be selling a board seat. I know that is one of Graham's concerns. We've had long discussions about that previously. What I was trying to say was that in order to sell a significant proportion of shares, most investors would look to have some sort of influence, and that would most likely be a board seat. That doesn't mean that that's what would be on offer. Obviously, any commercial deal would be up for negotiation.
Jane Lonsdale, legally, does company law trump any constitution and articles of association?
I don't think so, because I think in order to change, if we look at our constitution with the restricted actions, in order to remove them and therefore basically free up the ability of a shareholder to make changes, you would need members' buy-in on a large scale to do that. So I think people have, you get sort of crazy scenarios of, let's imagine, 5,000 people who all had the same objectives suddenly became members. I think we'd notice if there was an upswing and we'd start investigating. But I think we've been around now for more than 20 years and that's never happened. So I think that we're fairly confident that we have the protections in place, but obviously we will keep looking at those, and after tonight, as I've said, if anybody's got any other thoughts on what other protections we might want to put in place, then we're very open to hear those.
Jeff Steele talking about the shares versus voting rights. He says, are one share vote really considered to be worth as much as 3 share votes? He doesn't believe that's the case in other companies with multiple share classes.
In companies that are publicly quoted, Jeff's correct, we're not publicly quoted. There's not an open market. The only market that exists is the once a month, I'll call it auction for want of a better phrase, that Cedars holds. So in terms of valuation at the moment, it is 83p a share. But if we were quoted on an open exchange, then indeed those shares would be deemed to have higher economic value.
And the last question I've got online at the moment is from Lauren, who's basically going on about, again, the special resolutions and special actions. He says his question still wasn't answered from last time, which was about if 2 people get together to get more than 25% in PLC shares, could they still block any special resolutions?
Yeah, I think I answered it before. Yes, they could.
Can I just also make another comment on that? There's 2 parts to this discussion, and it is a bit of give and take potentially around what constitutional powers you might lose alongside the financial flexibility, because we can talk all we want about the Constitution, but in 2019 it came down to raising money, The Constitution wasn't offering the protection. The protection was supplied by the fans raising money. So this is also, it's a balancing act. It's not perfect. In a perfect world, we'd own all of the club. There'd be no debt. Everything would be fine and dandy. Life's not like that, unfortunately. So we've got to balance it.
That was the last online question. Is there any more from the room?
No.
Oh, there is one. Sean?
It's a relatively minor point, but with all the questions about the theoretical money that we've got for Ali, because no one actually knows, but ranging from, I don't know, 1.2 to 2.2, most people saying 1.7 and 25% to Wickham. And we're talking about, does that go to debt reduction or playing budget? But surely the key thing we need it for, if you look at the accounts for 2023, funny enough, it's about 1.7 million of player sales to balance the budget, and the previous season I think it's about 750,000, 800,000 pounds. So I'm assuming a large chunk will go straight into covering the shortfall that I assume is in a budget somewhere that we expect to arise, unless the results are spectacularly better than the last 2 years.
I don't think so. I believe that both on the football and the business side, everyone's incentivised to grow the revenues and keep our cost base down. So no, and that is a challenge. I know Graham and I battle all the time to say, put some money aside for debt repayment, and there are areas of the business that perform better or worse than others. I don't think we can keep operating on the basis that this money just goes to fund underperformance in other areas of the business. Those areas need to improve.
I don't know if you've had, so I take it from what you're saying, Michelle, then currently we are operating on an operating basis prior to any player sales and revenues at break even or better, for you to be able to say that.
Yeah, that's our target, absolutely.
I mean now, because I presume you've had the December numbers, hopefully, and they will be showing that we are on track to be at least break even on operating profit base.
Yeah, we are on track, absolutely. Yeah.
It's one good piece of good news I had all.
We've had a late question online from Adam Russell talking about our preference and priority for how we repay the bonds. He says, from what you can see, there's 4 options: windfalls from player sales, cup runs, etc., bond rollovers and new bonds, equity sales, or commercial finance. Is that a fair reflection on the order of preference for us as it stands for how we repay?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. Yeah.
No other questions have come in online. Is there last call for anything from the floor? Yeah, we've got one question on the floor.
Roger Hopkinson, you mentioned on new MD, I think it's MD, and you alluded to his thoughts, visions on growing revenue. Can you expand a little bit, please? We heard some before Christmas as well, so it'd be good to understand a little bit more. Thank you.
I think that he should speak for himself, to be honest, when he joins us. I think he starts on the 11th of March, and I know the club are keen to involve him in an event like this to introduce themselves. I suppose what I would say is, when we were interviewing candidates, there were people who had done and had experience of running stadiums, and James is not in that category. He has a very strong background in marketing and comms, and the work that he's done at Crystal Palace to grow revenues commercially through the brand and the story has been really impressive, and I know a number of people have been really interested in what Palace have been doing and the work that he's been doing. So I'm hoping personally that he will, we know, I'm not sure I would use the greatest story in football, but we know we have a very special story, and we haven't made the most of that. So I think that there is work to do. I think with our head of commercial, to look at sponsorships, etc. Obviously, the more of that type of revenue that we can generate, the better, because it mostly feeds straight through to the bottom line. But I'm not going to speak for James. He's a highly intelligent man, very, very charming, very nice person, and he lives locally. He lives with his young family, I think, very close by. So he's got a really good feel for the local area as well, which is really nice.
You touched on comms, and I think I could justify asking the question on the basis it's a financial matter because we paid for it. When will we get the results of one or other of the surveys that quite a lot of us participated in back in October, was it? And to what extent will we get them in detail? Will they be published?
Okay. So the first review, which was conducted by Q5, which was an organisational effectiveness review in management speak. We've had the results of that. We have had a joint board strategy day where we used the content of their report to discuss where we want to go next. I think we are all aware that we had some really brilliant things to focus on, getting back into the league, getting back here, and a number of people say, well, what next? What are we aiming for now? So some of the work was around that. Where do we want to aim for next? What does that look like? What are the timelines? What are the financial challenges? I don't think we'll publish it in the detail that it's in, because there's some quite micro recommendations and their names attached and so on. So we'll have a think at the PLC level.
Will it be published in some form?
I think that would be reasonable, but it might be tied into the output that comes next in terms of strategy. So I think high level we could certainly share some things, but I don't think we would share the detail. The comms review, which I think is the one that you're probably more interested in, has taken quite a bit longer than we expected because there were events happening in that field right in the middle of the work. I believe that it has almost been completed. Kev is nodding his head, so I think we're almost there. And then again, we'll do the same review at the board level to see what's appropriate to share. I think its remit expanded quite a bit beyond where we were originally starting, which is part of the reason it's taken longer. But
I think one could argue that as it's a survey into comms, we should communicate the comms survey with the community, and it's something a lot of people is hoping we'll get the detail of.
I'll give you what I can, Peter. So the review was started because I got the consultant in through a contact of mine. It was obviously something that the board wanted to do. It wasn't just someone I introduced, but a very capable person. The issue being obviously that what happened last summer delayed a lot of things. The other thing as well is with reviews, I've carried them out myself. They're very movable feasts because also one person's, I despise, as my colleagues on the board know, the word comms. I loathe it because it means everything and nothing. You can put anything in the box. For me, the really crucial element is that it gets the club A, thinking, and B, fit around strategic threats to the business. So the way that I kind of try to explain it when I talk to people is, when the club was very simple, and as Eric used to call it, a kind of classic small business, I've never forgotten the conversation we had where you used that phrase. It was a good phrase. Sorry, Eric, but it was in my research for my public relations postgraduate diploma. Things were simple. Things channeled through a single point of contact, and that's the way those organisations work, even when they're multifaceted and complex like a football club. They do, Peter. That's how they do work. It's relatively straightforward to run in that environment because you've got simple single relationships. You don't have excessive complexity. The thing is, of course, because we've doubled in size, but we've trebled and quadrupled in complexity. So now for me, the big element of the communication side of it is more about what you might call horizon scanning, reputational threats. It's not just about talking, because one of the problems that I have with this whole comms thing is what people mean half the time is saying stuff. And you don't have enough stuff to say anyway, because you can't tell people how much Ali Al-Hamadi was transferred for. You can give broad details. You can't go into the detail of a survey or a piece of internal work about structure around staffing, because quite rightly, there are people's jobs here. It doesn't matter whether the money ultimately came through money that we put over the turnstile. Point is you've got people's jobs and livelihoods. So it's much, the most important thing is that we start to take, I think, a strategic view and a long view about not just pushing information out, but the way we manage our entire self as a football club. And that's really, in the end, why it becomes more complicated, and partly why the review that Adam Harridance has led has taken so much longer, because ultimately it was dealing with a movable feast and a living organism of a football club that was going through all sorts of issues at the time we were trying to carry out the review. So yeah, it's going to be a good piece of work, and I think the board are going to be very happy with it, and I'm really hoping, and I'm sure he will because he seems like a smart cookie, that the new MD will see this as a great opportunity to start to create a lot more structure around that area. So there you go. I mean, that's, from my perspective, that's what I've been doing.
Sorry, just to say that the purpose of this meeting was not talk about the publication of reports. I appreciate your question, Peter. It will be for, I heard, we know what the question was. Will the recommendations be published? Yes, and it is not for the people in this room to make that decision. The PLC board, once they receive the report, will review the report, and as with any business recommendations, will decide what is appropriate or not appropriate to publish. Anything that's harmful to our reputation or commercial interests is not good to have in the public domain. So I don't think it's reasonable to demand that all the recommendations be published. Sorry, Peter, we can't hear you because you haven't got the mic on. So,
quite simply, I believe in both reports there will be some specific recommendations that will be in the best interest of this club. And as a lot of people took part in this survey, people who actually put themselves forward to take part in, but were not put forward themselves, put their time into this, I believe there should be some summary of these reports, the recommendations, the positive side. I don't believe in publishing anything damaging to this club. As Kevin suggested earlier, he brought up the word sinister in some question I asked. If I had any sinister question to ask, I'd ask it. There was nothing sinister in anything I've asked today. Yeah. And I sometimes think that there's a hesitancy here when people ask specific, at times difficult questions. Yeah, I value immensely what the Don's Trust Board is doing. I value immensely what you do, Michelle. I was very impressed earlier today when somebody spoke, you mentioned somebody has advocated putting their funds into an ISA. We are doing some wonderful things, and all I want to see is more fans being told what's going on. And as far as comms is concerned, we should communicate it to them.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not suggesting that there won't be anything published. What I'm saying is it needs to be reviewed, and I will certainly take your comments back to the PLC. Okay? Anybody else before we finish?
Yeah, we've got a couple of online ones to end on before we wrap up quickly. Jeff Steele talking about who will have control over the sale and applications of assets in relation to CapEx. So I'm assuming that...
I don't think we're talking about selling any assets. So in terms of the development of the ground, is that?
Yeah, I'm assuming that's what he's referring to.
So, you know, in the same way that this ground was built in partnership with an organisation that built the housing around the ground, we would look almost certainly, because actually interesting, just by way of background, we have brought in a new chair of the development committee, who's a very experienced property lawyer, and what attracted me to him in the interview process was him saying, my starting point would be, we have no cash, we can't take any more debt on, and we can't offer any security, and that's the starting point for any deal with a third party. So, you know, whether we looked at building a hotel somewhere around the ground, building out the stands, we would be looking to do that in partnership with another party. So we wouldn't be looking to sell, you know, part of the stadium, for example. So we're not looking at property sales, we're looking at how we can invest and grow the asset that we have.
And the last question from Mike Needham is talking about, if we do drop below 75%, could we have a resolution to get back up above it in the future if we wanted to?
Yeah, so I don't think we need a resolution, but I think what it does need, and Graham and I have talked about this, is possibly some changes in the Dons Trust's objectives that include the financial activism, so that our objective is always, if there is an opportunity and funds are available, to buy shares, to keep our percentage ownership as high as we possibly can. And the point we talked about earlier about going to the PLC shareholders who invested their funds way back when very kindly, to ask them if they will give their shares to us, so that also creates a buffer and we keep the Dons Trust percentage as high as we possibly can. That would always be our aim. We wouldn't, you know, we wouldn't go any lower than we possibly had to.
Just a clarification on Jeff Steele's question about that he meant decisions between debt repayment and CapEx in relation to.
So I think that would be something for the PLC board to discuss and agree. You know, they are the operating board, they're the ones that make the decisions day to day on what's best for the club overall. If there was anything that fell within, so I don't know if you remember, as part of the governance changes, we brought in a memorandum of understanding between the trust and the PLC board, and we listed different things that the PLC board could go away and make a decision on their own, things that they had to refer to the Dons Trust board. So for example, the alley sale, that was a worked up proposal over quite a period of time that the PLC board signed off, and then it went to the Dons Trust board. And then there are certain things that the Dons Trust board would then have to go to members on. So there's a tier of decisions, so it would depend where it fell. The Broncos deal is a good example of that. You know, that went all the way from the club through to members to sign off.
Yeah, that's the last online question.
Wonderful. Okay.
Right. I think you're going to close the meeting now, and I'd like to say on behalf of all the Dons Trust members that are here tonight and those that are online as well, thank you very much for your contribution and the background work that Graham Michelle and Kevin have done, which has been prominent in what we've been discussing tonight. So thanks very much from all of us.
Thank you. And thank you for managing the mic as well so wonderfully. Thanks very much, everyone. You're welcome to stay for a while, have another drink, boost the coffers of the club or not.